Yes, great question. It allows me to expand on. Remember when I said that the rules of globalization or globalization regimes rely both on explicit rules, but also on norms that are internalized in a state's behavior. And if I have to say that, in fact, 75%, if not 80% of hyperglobalization, the type of economic globalization we've had in the last 30, 40 years, has been enforced not through the WTO or explicit trade agreements, but through rules of good behavior that individual policymakers internalize. The fact that countries maintain international sort of property rights regimes and financial regulations and capital account regulations that enable the free flow of capital and free flow of finance is not the consequence of the enforcement by any other age. It's not that the IMF comes and makes you do it. It's not that the OECD enforces it on you. So the enforcement is done always on the part of nations that have internalized the logic of the regime, and then deploy the enforcement power of the national, sort of legal and police authority to enforce it on the domestic actors like firms and banks. That's true even in the trade regime, because if you left it to the WTO dispute resolution, it takes 10 years for anything to go through the dispute resolution regime. But what maintains supply chains and free flow of trade and goods is really that domestic countries are restraining their own policies. So it's actually action at the national level. So I think the analog in the area of health would be not that the WHO would be actually itself enforcing whatever rules on circulation of people or domestic travel, that it would create a certain set of norms and expectations that are then internalized in the behavior of national governance, would then enforce those domestically, because ultimately the legal enforcement and police enforcement powers are at the level of local and national governance, not international. So that's why I think sort of these sort of the development of these norms are so important. That it's rules are useful, but it's going to be the norms that is going to make you do that, and whether those ends are achieved or not. Everything I've said basically implicitly assumed that political authorities, political accountability and representation is still largely organized around nation states, is at the national level. But what Varun is saying is you can also envisage a world where, in fact, more and more democratic deliberation, democratic decision-making, democratic accountability and representation migrates transnationally to international organizations, so that organizations like WTO, WHO, are not necessarily sort of technocratic institutions, but they're actually sort of democratic organizations, or at least they're governed through mechanism of democratic delegation at the transnational level. Now, conceptually, you can envisage a world like that, and in some ways, probably the part of the world that could, in principle, come closest to that would have been the European Union. Think about the European Union as a kind of a regime of a regional hyperglobalization regime with a single market, single money, and a set of rules that are enforced through a European Central Bank and the acquis communautaire that are on which the single market and the single money resides in. We could envisage a kind of transnational set of a quasi-federalism within Europe, where essentially national authorities are just become sort of like local governments in the United States, but that all decision-making, including, very importantly, sort of fiscal decision-making, migrates to Brussels, to the European Parliament or to the European Commission. Now that, in principle, is possible. Although I mentioned the European Union to point sort of, how even in the context of Europe, a relatively sort of smaller number of nations, this has become practically impossible route to follow. That this may not be a practical possibility for the world as a whole, but certainly, conceptually, one way you can cut through this kind of what I've called the political trilemma of the world economy by envisaging that it's global rulemaking that becomes much more directly democratic and democratically accountable. First, I mean, I do think that a middle ground is possible. I mean, when I discuss economic globalization, I go back to the first 3 or 4 decades after the Second World War, the GATT regime and trade, which was a kind of a thinner model of trade globalization, which was very successful. And I do think it is possible to have a kind of a middle ground where we focus our sort of global rulemaking, global norm development to areas where there are very clear arguments in terms of restraining or disciplining beggar thy neighbor policies and generating global public goods, and that's where we focus. I mean, I think the earlier Bretton Woods regime, the Bretton Woods / GATT regime, I think was much more in line with those ideas than what we got after the 1990s. So yes, I do think that kind of a middle ground is possible, and I think, but ultimately, as I was responding to Shweta's question, ultimately, all of this, the enforcement and the job will have to be done by national governments, unless we're in this sort of global federalism, which is neither here nor there really. Ultimately, the capacity and the ability of national governments to enforce good policy, whether it is those that have been developed through international cooperation or norms, or those that are sort of the result of the domestic democratic decision making, ultimately it's all going to rest on the ability of domestic governments to enforce. And I think you're rightly emphasizing enforcement and capacity. So, that's, there's no way of getting out of it. There's no globalization, no amount of global rules, no amount of global cooperation that's going to really make a huge amount of difference to the ability of national governments to do what's right for their own people. Now, the international community can do a lot of harm. So I think, there's a kind of do no harm principle. But ultimately, it's going to be sort of the national government's capacity and ability, and that's where a lot of the action still remains. Well, I think politically, I think any sensible, reasonable regime for enhancing global labor mobility, I think, has been put off by a further decade by this health crisis. So it wasn't on the agenda even beforehand for a variety of reasons. That's a whole subject on its own. But I like to keep it on our minds because it's the one area of economic globalization where the benefits, where the economic gains from trade are much, much larger than anything else that we're currently negotiating on in international trade or finance. And that with appropriate redistributive arrangements is something that could actually provide benefits to all. We have to keep it on the agenda, but I think politically it's neither here nor there, frankly, unfortunately. And the question is, is this a time where you bring that out to the forefront and say, there's a window of opportunity where we might, do things that might not have been done during periods of relative calm, because people might be willing to accept some change because we're so desperate for action. Or do you say, this is not the time for structural remedies. This is time for very quick action to remedy the consequences of the immediate crisis. So very, very concrete example. I'm not a big fan of UBI, universal basic income. But I think at this point, if we can get checks out the door to people, we should do that, and that's something we ought to do because it's going to provide immediate remedy. And I wouldn't be concerned too much about whether it's one of those remedies that's sort of under the sort of structural transformation agenda that we might think of for longer. So I think yes, I think priorities have to change. I think if you were to talk to Roberto Unger, you probably would say that there isn't such a trade-off, that this is, as any time, this is the time also to move forward with those structural alternatives agenda. But I think I see it a little bit differently, that I think there is, as a practical matter, there's a difference between things that you can do very, very quickly and that you should do, and you should spend your political capital on that. And I think something like UBI or sending everybody checks is something you ought to do if that's something you can do quickly, because it's sort of immediate help to people. Please, all of you, stay safe, and maybe we'll do another one of these soon again, and see you virtually, if not in person, soon.